Hi, this is Mr. Gideon. So we've talked about money, how to measure money, how money's created in the system by banks, as well as the Federal Reserve, our central bank. Although we say that money isn't necessarily created by the Fed, it is distributed by the Fed, which ultimately can increase the money supply. But let's pause and hear from one of the more well-known financial experts, the host of Mad Money, Jim Cramer. Go ahead and do this by pausing this video and then clicking on this link and watching it now. So welcome back. Hope you enjoyed that rant. What's Cramer ranting about though? Lowering the discount rate, or as he put it, opening the discount window, which he was frantically begging the Fed to do to help during that crisis. So let's recap the three tools of monetary policy that are implemented by the Fed when it chooses to do so. And this doesn't just go for the Federal Reserve of the United States. We're talking about central banks in many countries. One is to change the reserve requirement. Remember, this is the percentage that banks in the system are required to hold as reserves. That's a percentage of their deposits, their liability side of the T account. Number two, they can change the discount rate for those banks who want to borrow from the Fed to meet the reserve requirement if they're not in compliance. It's usually an overnight lending arrangement. They have to meet over a 2-week average, the reserve requirement. If they don't want to borrow from the Fed, of course, and pay the discount rate, then they can always borrow in the federal funds market from other banks and pay the Fed funds rate. The third option is to conduct open market operations, and this is the preferred method, of course. Keep in mind that when the central bank purchases or sells short-term bonds, sometimes this is referred to as T-bills, that this tool is not the same kind of transaction that's recorded for those banks on their in their T accounts or simplified balance sheets, the way that you or I get involved in the possible increase of the money supply with a deposit to our banks. When we make a deposit, it's recorded on the liability side of the T account, so on the right-hand side under liabilities. And it's recorded as a demand deposit or checkable deposit, DD, CD. But when the Fed buys bonds, it's not like they're opening a checking account like you and me. Their action directly affects the bank's reserves on the asset side of the T account. And so here are a couple of examples of that. In A, this is an example of an open market purchase of $100 million worth of T-bills that banks would have out there in the system because banks don't have to loan every dollar that they're legally allowed to do. Some banks are more conservative than others, and they say, well, okay, we'll put 10% of all the deposits aside, and that leaves us 90% to loan against, but maybe we don't want to do all 90%. Maybe we want to do 70% and then put the rest in T-bills or something else that's relatively liquid. It could look something like this, where for the Federal Reserve's T account, when they make this purchase, they acquire $100 million from several banks out there in the market that become assets on that side of their T account. And then as a liability, they're increasing the monetary base by the same amount, 100 million. For those commercial banks, their T account would look something like this, where they have now sold off treasury bills, so they deduct that as an asset from that side of the T account, but they have an increase in reserves. And the whole point, of course, is that hopefully they'll lend a good chunk of these reserves and start a chain reaction that helps the economy. Notice on this side that there's no change. There would be something recorded there if you or I said, yeah, I want to open a checking account, or I want to make an addition to my checking account, a demand deposit. That would change this side of the ledger. But you'd also see a change to this side of the ledger if you or I are involved. It's a little different animal when the Fed is involved. This is the opposite, of course, of a purchase. This is a sale where they're trying to constrict the money supply. Also keep in mind that technically the change in the bank's reserves caused by an open market operation doesn't directly affect the money supply per se. It's a short step right before that happens, assuming it does happen. We're going to talk in a few minutes about how sometimes it doesn't happen the way that we think it's going to, but instead it starts the money multiplier in motion after the $100 million increase in reserves. shown in panel A, for instance, commercial banks are expected to lend out their additional reserves, expected according to this model, this theory. It's not something that the Federal Reserve or some other central bank is going to mandate by law. But if assuming they do that, that would immediately increase the money supply by 100 million. But why would anybody, Jim Cramer or otherwise, care about changing the money supply, using the discount rate or any other tool? Well, because of the chain reaction that's possible. And I've put this in bold caps and put an asterisk here because really this is the major focal point of the entire unit of monetary policy for this class and for the AP exam. The bottom line that we've been building to is this whole chain reaction, so it's really, really important. Okay. First of all, if we're in a recessionary gap, as a starting point, most people believe, all things being equal, that if you increase the money supply, then that'll lead to a decrease in interest rates, which leads to an increase in loans to buy goods and services. Of course, it becomes cheaper now, since interest rates are lower, for whoever wants to buy something that they don't have the money for to go ahead and take a loan and buy it. That, of course, for you and me in the C, or for companies in the I, leads to an increase in consumption and investment, which leads to an increase in aggregate demand. I mean, C and I are both components of aggregate demand. You'll recall that using the expenditures approach, the aggregate demand for real GDP is C plus I plus G plus NX. So that would increase to a whole bunch, lead to an increase in a whole bunch of good stuff. Greater output, greater income, greater employment. Although greater or higher prices, the price level will go up because we're shifting AD to the right, and a decrease in unemployment. Now, you could use the same chain of events in reverse order, so to speak, or maybe not in reverse order, but with reverse effects, if you have an inflationary gap. So the Fed could decrease the money supply, and in the market for money, that would increase interest rates, which would lead to a decrease in loans to buy goods and services. And so now, because it's more expensive to take these loans, fewer people can afford them, and so people like you and me, the C, or companies, the I, will do exactly that. We'll take fewer loans and buy less stuff, and that'll lead to a decrease in aggregate demand, which will give us a decrease in output, income, employment, the price level, while you would have an increase in unemployment. Now, why would you do that? Well, because the whole point of an inflationary gap, of course, is that prices are too high. And so, at least in the short run, even though you might have to put up with a higher rate of unemployment, think back to the short-run Phillips curve, okay? Even though you might have to put up with a little higher unemployment, the price level is so just oppressively high that we have to take this action to get the price level down and under control. Now, it's one thing to write the chain reaction out, which you need to do with some regularity. I know that if you're hearing this over the course of a summer, there's no way for me to check on this. You're listening to this during the course of a school year. There's only so much time we have in class, but like with so many other lessons, the best way for you to truly retain it is to put pen to paper, or if you have to, stylus to screen, and write this out several times so that it really sinks in. But not just write the chain reaction. Show this occurring with graphs. And then you can, of course, add the chain reaction below. I'm not going to do that right now, but sometimes when people come into XBlock during the regular school year, I'll say, all right, let's talk about this chain reaction. Let's start with the graphs. And then, kind of narrate with the chain reaction using abbreviations, because that's fine during an XBlock. It's not like they're being tested, so I don't expect people to write it out longhand. But show that chain reaction summarized with the symbols that I just showed you. How would that look? This whole chain reaction that we've been building to in the monetary policy unit. Well, of course, first we have to get to the point where we can draw stuff. And you're going to have the money market on one side. And you're going to have the economy, let's say the U.S. economy in this case, on the other side. Since we've done it many times before, I'm not going to waste your time showing an entire legend again. I'm just going to show the important pieces of this chain reaction. But the first piece, of course, was, let's say we're in, a recessionary gap, and that's a problem. Why is that a problem? Because if we're at that point, currently where the economy is, where SORAS and AD intersect, is less than our full potential. Our full potential is over here under long-run aggregate supply. This, of course, is where you find the natural level of unemployment, the natural level of output, the natural level of income, and even full employment. So, of course, we want to eliminate this gap. Now, what do? As we just said a minute ago, we increase the money supply. And when I say we, I'm actually talking about the central bank, of course. So you recall in the money market, just like with any market, prices on the left-hand side, quantities down below. No, not much different if you're talking about the U.S. economy, but because we're talking about all prices, we talk about price level measured by CPI or some other measure like real GDP deflator. We're talking about all products and services produced in a country in a year for sale at some point. So getting back to the market concept, micro concept, of course, right? This is not just going to be labeled price, it's interest rate. Do you remember which one? There's the money market interest rate and the real, oops, messed that one up, I gave you the answer. There's the loanable funds market interest rate, which is the real interest rate. So hopefully you've already guessed by now that this is nominal interest rate, which you've seen before, abbreviated with little I sub 1, and the vertical curve, because this is the short term. This is money with maturity of less than 1 year, is a vertical and inflexible curve. Oops, I almost put AD. And the demand for money, supply for money, the equilibrium quantity for money initially is there. That's what we show down on this axis. So what happens when we increase the supply for money? Because that's supposed to be the policy prescription according to this model and this chain reaction that we are trying to illustrate here. Well, if we increase the supply for money, that leads to a new equilibrium interest rate and a new quantity. But this is the key piece. Interest rates decrease. Interest rates decrease, it becomes more affordable for people to take loans. And why do you take a loan? Because you want to spend money on something and you don't have the money. So if it becomes more affordable, more people will do it. If they spend more money, well, this is where the spenders are found. The demanders are along the AD curve. And one way you can calculate the total amount of demand is by adding up these sectors of the circular flow, the international sector, the government sector, investment by firms and companies, and of course consumption by households. And chain reaction says these two segments will increase how much they purchase. Ceteris paribus, nothing else changing, then of course AD is going to shift to the right. If those two components shift and nothing else changes, then the whole body of the animal, so to speak, shifts, right? And we get to a new place, Q sub 2. And fortunately now, in this case, because we were in a recessionary gap, and that's tough on the employment picture, employment gets better. We have to live with higher prices, but at least that piece gets better. And that is an illustration of the first chain reaction that we were talking about. Now, of course, you can show the second chain reaction happening, but I'm not going to do that now. If you were going to, you would show the U.S. economy or wherever economy that's been stipulated in an inflationary gap, and showing it move from 81 to the left and 82 being at long-run equilibrium. And then, of course, over here where we start with a decrease in the money supply rather than an increase, which is going to increase interest rates and so forth. So this sounds good, and conventional monetary policy, like we've just discussed, works a lot of the time, but not all the time. One of the limits of monetary policy is that the lowest an interest rate can go in the marketplace is 0%. So if the economy is struggling with high unemployment or some other undesirable situation, moving rates down further to encourage consumption or investment isn't an option for the central bank if they're already at 0%. You can't go below that. That's what we call a zero bound, or think of it as the zero boundary, but we call it in economics a zero bound, the fact that the interest rate can't go below zero. So what happens if a country hits the zero bound? Well, first recall this formula. Real interest rate equals the nominal interest rate minus expected inflation. You're smart enough now to know, look, if I'm going to take a loan or if I'm going to give a loan, and we agree to a nominal interest rate of whatever, let's say 3%, that's not the real interest rate necessarily if that's a loan of a year or more. But recall that formula. And let's plug a number in. Let's plug in 0% for the nominal interest rate. If the nominal interest rate was 0% in the marketplace, because we're at a zero bound now, and then people expect 2% inflation, that would equal a real interest rate of negative 2%. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't want to lose money in that kind of a transaction. If I'm going to loan somebody, money at a nominal interest rate of 0%, and there's inflation happening. It just doesn't make any sense. Nobody would want to do that. So what are we saying here? We're saying if there's a zero bound, that would lead to banks refusing to lend because it's more profitable just to hold on to their cash than lose money. And if there's a negative inflation added to a zero bound rather than this modest 2% inflation, some consumers, at least, and firms will refuse to spend because holding cash yields a positive real rate of return. This is a very similar concept. So we call this situation a liquidity trap. We're trapped in a very liquid market, a liquid situation, when conventional monetary policy is ineffective because nominal interest rates are up against bound. And cash being the most liquid form of money, this is hopefully one way you can think of the liquidity trap. You know, we're thinking of people saying, I'm going to hold on to my cash. I'm going to be as liquid as possible because right now I know enough about inflation to understand that I should hold on to my cash because that's a better deal for me right now. I'm going to stay liquid. And the economy can become trapped in this, demand for people wanting to stay liquid. So you might want to think of it as a cash trap, to recall the phrase, where increases in the monetary base will either be held in bank vaults or held as cash by individuals and firms without being spent. And this has happened in U.S. history. This is only one illustration that shows in the shaded area going back to the period of the Great Depression, our interest rates got down to the zero bound. And we all know what a difficult time that was in our country's history. It also happened during what we call Japan's lost decade, much more recently, when after the stock and real estate bubbles burst, the Bank of Japan, their central bank, like our Fed, repeatedly cut rates to try to fight weakness in the economy, and they got down to the zero bound themselves. And it was a difficult thing to climb out of. In 2008 and 2009 in the United States, the Fed also found itself up against a zero bound. Question is, are we still trapped? You can answer this question, but here's an important piece of information that you might want to consider. Bank reserves in our country went from $10 billion in 2008 up to $1.2 trillion in 2010. Seems, with that evidence anyway, that banks are holding on to their cash, and they're not making loans like we expected them to. In the United States, the recent path by the Fed of increasing the money supply in an effort to aid the economy is also known as quantitative easing. So if you hear this phrase, whether it was quantitative easing 1 or quantitative easing 2, this is what they're talking about. But if we're near the zero bound and we're caught right now, or at least if we've been caught in the last couple of years in a liquidity trap, why still do it? At the time of this recording, it's summer 2011, the Federal Reserve is just completing QE2, a buying of $600 billion worth of bonds designed in part to influence the interest rate. Why do something like this? If it looks like over the last several months, last couple of years, it really hasn't had the effect, at least on the unemployment rate, which is still quite high, that it had hoped. Well, your guess is as good as mine, but there's a funny video that a student recently brought to my attention that I think you'll enjoy, that tries to address this intelligently but also sarcastically. They're going to mention in the video Goldman Sachs. It's probably the most well-known and the richest investment bank in the United States. So go ahead and click on this link, enjoy it, and then come back after you pause this video. Alright, I hope you enjoyed that. Here's a cartoon that seems to have the same tone to it, where the Fed's pumping money into the economy and rescuing the banks, but for some reason the rest of us are left treading water and trying not to drown.